Is a dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology. Welcome to another interview episode of TEFLology. Today we're very happy to present an interview with Scott Thornbury. Scott Thornbury is an internationally recognised academic and teacher trainer and has published numerous articles and books, such as How to Teach Grammar, Teaching Unplugged, and An A to Z of ELT. He is also known for his advocacy of the unplugged approach to teaching and is a keen blogger and prolific speaker and conference presenter. Scott lives in Spain, but we were lucky enough to meet him during one of his trips to Japan, where he was giving a special lecture. Matt and Matthew sat down with Scott and asked him some questions about his career, his thoughts on English language teaching, and about the ELT industry in general.
Hi, this is Matthew.
And this is Matt.
And we're very happy to be sitting here with Scott Thornbury. Thank you for agreeing to be interviewed by us.
My pleasure.
Okay, so we'll get straight into it, I guess.
Yeah, so perhaps just by way of introduction, could you kind of maybe briefly describe your career as a language teacher, teacher trainer, and of course writer as well?
Yes, well, I mean, briefly, I can be as brief as I can. We're talking about 40 years here, I discovered to my horror just this year. I'm one of the probably dwindling generation of teachers who started teaching confident that as a native speaker I could get away with very little training, and did the mandatory 4-week course in London in that 40 years ago, ended up in a private language school on the south coast of England, and before long was teaching in Egypt, and before long, because it was a rapidly expanding market, I was kind of mentoring new teachers, and then next stage was I was kind of resident teacher trainer, I guess, materials writer. Went back to London, got some more training, did a diploma course, went back to Egypt, went back to London, got some more training, did an MA, went to Spain, and so on. So, yeah, it was a kind of pretty standard trajectory, with sort of pretty regular changes of, well, not that regular. I mean, I was a long time in Egypt, I've been a long time in Spain, those are my main bases. So, but regular upgrading, I guess, in terms of qualifications and skills, and one of those being writing, which kind of emerged out of teacher training. You know, you write a lot of worksheets for teaching the language analysis component of diploma course. Somebody says, those worksheets look pretty good, maybe we could publish them. Next thing you know, you've got a book out. Next thing you know, somebody else is saying, we're writing a course book, but we'd like you to write the workbook because you're good on grammar. And so you write the workbook, and the next thing they say, oh, you've written that workbook, would you like to write a course book because you're good at writing workbooks, and so on, so on, so on. So, but I was relatively lucky. Also, I worked for a very good organisation most of my career, which was International House, which really looked after their teachers, and where there was a culture of professional development, and that really helped. And as I say, I mean, I was lucky. That's not always the case.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. So maybe, again, still looking at your history as a teacher and teacher trainer, in our podcast, each episode we feature what we call a TEFL pioneer, and basically choose somebody from TEFL history, ELT history. Is there, can you, maybe not one figure, but is there somebody you can point to as maybe one of the biggest influences on you?
There's been so many, but I mean, I guess in the first book I read on English language teaching from cover to cover wasn't until I'd been teaching for about 5 years, to my shame. I mean, you just didn't read books those days, and they weren't actually that available when I was teaching, which was in Egypt. I picked up this copy of this book called Away and Ways by Earl Stevick, who is an American writer working very much within the kind of humanist tradition. In fact, he kind of popularized that educational tradition within our own field of English language teaching during the 1970s and 80s and beyond in working from the United States but travelling extensively around the world. I never had actually met him, to my great regret. He had been in Spain prior to my first arriving there, was a regular visitor, but he was getting on and I never met him. I did correspond with him on one or two occasions. This only last year, a very good friend of his who also works in Spain in a university there wanted to put together a book, a kind of tribute volume for him, and she asked me to contribute, and I wrote a chapter for that, and the book, called Meaningful Action, which is an expression of his, came out last year just in time for him to see it before he sadly passed away.
Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah.
It is a good book. It's an excellent book, I have to say.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, I'm saying that with I have to declare an interest because I've got an article in it, but it's a very good book because it covers a lot of the issues which he first popularised in the 70s and the 80s that, as I say, were under the umbrella of humanistic teaching theory, sort of those methods, etc. A holistic view of teaching, an emphasis on the affective side of learning, not just the cognitive side. And this was something that we need to be reminded about, and it was a great opportunity to put those things back on the table again and say, look, it hasn't gone away. In fact, if anything, it's coming back in force. A lot of the research is suggesting that there's so much more to language learning than what goes on in the little black box in the head.
That kind of leads to our next question. So, what do you think of the current kind of schisms or debates in the ELT field at the moment?
Well,
that's one of them.
Yeah. Well, it is. Yeah, I mean, it isn't actually because we're still so. Well, we're so grounded in the kind of cognitive, the mind as a computer kind of metaphor, which really got going in the 80s and it competed with other metaphors for the mind, like the more humanist one, the mind as a garden, all you need to do is water it. But it's not actually one of the controversies that exercises teachers so much now. I think the controversies that exercise teachers are more to do, I think, or they ought to be exercising teachers. So the nature of English itself, what is it, who speaks it, who owns it, the whole issue of English as an international language, English as a lingua franca, really when you think about it, changes the ball game completely. It raises the whole issue of who's best equipped to teach it. If it's an international language, do you need native speakers to teach it? This is what I meant when I say I'm a kind of dinosaur in that respect, because I come from that generation which took it for granted that you need native speakers. It also raises the question: do you need classes only in English, or could you accept a degree of code switching and multilingualism in the classrooms if multilingualism is also the norm? It also raises the question as to what standards are we aspiring to teach, which raises the question about accuracy, which raises the question about testing, which raises the question about textbooks. I mean, it has ripple effects right throughout everything we do. If you move the goalpost, you move the playing field. I said that.
So maybe kind of addressing that issue, but I think you're known for covering a lot of different topics in your writing and kind of presentations. What do you think is maybe the most significant variable, maybe just in terms of the classroom, in terms of successful language learning? Was that like methodology or motivation?
Well, you said it, I think, motivation. I mean, you can't get away from that. I think the difference between... methods don't make a blind bit of difference in the long run. There's been no research which has come out conclusively to say method A works better than method B when you factor out all the variables, which you can't actually do. Right. The teacher, the other students, the materials, etc. But if you intuitively, I think, and I think there's probably research evidence that suggests this, that all things being equal, the motivated student is going to do better than the non-motivated student, which raises the whole question as to why even start then if the students are unmotivated. And 99% of the students, particularly say in primary or secondary school, are not motivated to learn English in the sense that they have a strong need for it, or a felt need for it. Therefore, you say, well, it's kind of like we're damned before we start kind of thing. What's the point? But you can, of course, the teacher can do an awful lot to motivate learners in the classroom in terms of the short term by making the whole experience more pleasurable. And we come back to the humanist side of things, less stressful, which we come back to the accuracy side of things, than it customarily is. So I think we shouldn't think that, oh yeah, because it's motivation, it's a lost cause. No, teachers can do an awful lot. And I don't mean just turning the classroom into fun and games, although I accept that, particularly for young learners, an element of fun and games is going to help. Or I don't mean just importing technology into the classroom, because somehow that's going to be motivating, because it's not nowadays, because students have got just as much technology outside the classrooms. They're not exactly amazed by the fact that you've got an interactive whiteboard. Motivation comes from all sorts of things, but basically the things that keep us going as human beings is social motivation, the need to be a part of a group. And that can be a small group, like in a classroom. So one of the teacher's jobs is creating a dynamic in the classroom so that people want to keep coming back. And if they keep coming back, they might pick up some English on the way. But if they don't come back, they're not going to pick up any English.
So do you think it's important from a very early stage in a new teacher's career to really understand the social impact?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've for so long sort of ignored that at our peril by focusing on the transmissive nature of teaching, which is all about teaching grammar and teaching vocabulary and tricks to do that, etc. And we've perhaps overlooked the social aspect of education generally, and of language learning in particular. And again, that's what brings you back to the humanists and L. Stevick, etc. So they said, no, we do that, as I say, at our peril. We've got to. You cannot teach something if you don't have the social dynamic for which is conducive to learning.
Right.
Yeah. We noticed that the course we teach, as we mentioned, is 8 students. And it's interesting, especially in the first few weeks of the course, they're not really aware of the teacher at all. The only thing they can, as far as we can tell, they're thinking about is what their neighbors think of, And so every time they speak, for us it's language practice, but for them it's how are they seen by their classmates. And those kind of groupings seem to be a bigger predictor for success than anything else.
I would say so, yeah. 8 is good, ideal in a sense, because it's not too small, it's not too big. But I think it is possible, even in larger groups, to create. You've got to work a bit harder at it. But those are kind of skills, as you say, that need to be part of any kind of basic training. It's the classroom management, which doesn't mean just putting people into groups and things, but it means creating the right, as I say, dynamic in the classroom, which is conducive to that social bonding.
Maybe switching tack a little bit. Maybe I missed a few, but at least 5 of your books have the word grammar in the title, including How to Teach Grammar and other things. But you've also often described grammar as elusive and slippery and messy. How important do you think is it for language teachers to have a firm grasp of at least what grammar means to them?
Well, yeah, I am a bit ashamed of having focused so much on grammar, and I think part of the reason is that as a profession we focus so much on grammar, and so in a sense, if you want to sell books, you should put the word grammar in the title. However, you're correct in saying that I have, and I think it comes through in my books, that doesn't mean to say that our job is to transmit knowledge about, or the facts of grammar to the learners. And everything I've been written about grammar is to try to disabuse people, that they've got to stand up in front of the class and lecture about grammar. However, coming back to your question, I do think it is the teacher's responsibility to know as much as they can about the language, not just about the grammar, obviously, but every aspect of the language. And that's a tall order, because language is enormous and language is constantly changing. So you really do need to keep up to date. But it's that background knowledge of the language which gives you a degree of authority, both in terms of choosing materials, writing materials, designing syllabuses, that's on the sort of overview, and the actual classroom, dealing with language issues that come up errors that students make and knowing how to deal with them. So, I mean, I think without actually necessarily teaching grammar as such, you still need, as I say, to know a lot about it. I would also qualify that by saying you need to know quite a lot about your students' first language grammar. If they're Japanese students, you don't have to speak Japanese, or the ideal, but you need to know how the system works, because it's going to come up against English somewhere, and you need to be able to sort that out. And I think it's been, again, coming back to this kind of native speaker model of teaching, it's been a great, it's a kind of travesty in a sense that we've encouraged teachers to go out into foreign parts without insisting that they learn the language of the part that they're going to. Because in fact those models of teacher training when I was first trained were for multilingual classes working in language schools on the south coast of Britain, where there's no way that you'll be able to know all your students' first languages nor integrate them into the classroom. Nevertheless, that kind of situation, when you think about it on a global scale, is actually tiny. It's probably 5% of what goes on in English language teaching. Most teachers are teaching in the context in which their learners, their home context, as it were, and therefore it behooves them to know something about that language. So it's language analysis and knowledge both of English but also of the learner's L1.
Do you, in terms of like language awareness of English, and maybe addressing the non-native teacher thing, for non-native teachers, I mean, are you saying that there should be a kind of threshold of
no, I don't. Some people would say that. I think if you look at what teaching competence is all about, it's language teaching competence is about three things essentially. One is knowing the language, being able to speak the target language. So to some degree of proficiency, and that's the next question is what's the degree of it. The other one is knowing about the language, and that is to say meta-linguistic knowledge. And the third one is pedagogical skills. And what tends to happen is that every teacher comes into this profession with a kind of and not a balanced equation of those three factors. They'll have, if they're a native speaker, they'll speak the language pretty well, but they won't know very much about it. They won't have much metalinguistic knowledge. And when they're starting, they have very little in the way of pedagogic skills. So they'll use their pedagogic skills to make up for the fact that they have no metalinguistic knowledge. That's compensatory. Similarly, and I'm talking in generalizations here, but your non-native teacher of English will probably not feel confident, at least in their proficiency, not compared to a native speaker, wisely or unwisely. But they probably will have quite advanced metalinguistic knowledge because they would have spent years studying the language. So they will use their pedagogical skills to make up for the fact that they've lacked confidence in their spoken English. So it's all swings and roundabouts. But so your training should address the area that you feel least confident in. But either way, it's your pedagogical skills, and in the end, it's going to make up for whatever deficiencies you have in one or the other, metalinguistic knowledge or language proficiency. It's all about teaching. So arguably, you could take this argument to its extreme and say it's conceivable that you could have a teacher of a language who didn't speak a word of that language, not a single word, but had access to a grammar and a vocabulary and knew everything about that language technically, and then had the pedagogical skills to teach it. I think this is not an entirely unrealistic situation where you take a language like Sanskrit, for example, or Latin, that nobody actually speaks it, but you can teach it because we have all the stuff about it. So you use the pedagogical skills to teach the language. It's an extreme case, but I think in the end, theoretically at least, there is no bottom line. But it's all about having those compensatory pedagogical skills.
So I guess my question is, do we need this term native speaker?
No. It's totally redundant. It has no currency anymore for all these various reasons, because it doesn't distinguish good teachers from bad teachers for a start. And nor does it's out of date, because as I said before, the context is we're in a non-native world, if you like. The native speaker, whatever that is a dying species. And the standards that native speakers once were thought to set no longer seem to apply. So I think, as Alistair Pennycook said in a book recently, he said something to the effect that the distinction between native speaker and non-native speaker does no more useful work, or does no useful work anymore. It should be,
What I'm wondering
trash.
is, are textbooks or representations in textbooks at odds with the real world?
Well, I mean,
it's quite general. But
they always have been. They're always a step behind. I mean, the course books very rarely, in my experience, have caused change. They're always followed, often reluctantly, after change. Not reluctantly, but I mean, they're slow to absorb because there's so much at stake. And also, some publishers have had their fingers burned before by making too rapid changes on the anticipation this is the way things are going to go, and then they haven't. So they're very, very conservative. That's the fact of the matter. But I mean, it's also exacerbated by the fact that so much of the so-called industry now is driven by exams, and therefore even course books have to sort of follow what the exams want them to teach. So there's enormous pressure to not rock the boat in terms of publishing, examining, and that kind of thing. So we work within this kind of we work under the pressure and under the constraints of, as I say, these kind of hegemonic kind of pressures. We have to find what room we can in our own classrooms to subvert those pressures where we think we can get away with it.
So I guess that's where unplugging and...
Well, exactly, and you can unplug from the course book, you can unplug from technology to the extent that you can get away with it, really. But in the full confidence that it's actually doing the learners probably a lot of good, and that the lessons that they will remember were the unplugged lessons, the ones that they weren't using coursebook material as opposed to the ones where they were using coursebook. You ask any learner, what was the most memorable lesson of the last semester? And say, it was that time that Etsuku came in with a broken leg and we all talked about his skiing accident.
You talked a little bit earlier the metaphor of the brain as a computer, and just talking a little bit about CLT in terms of maybe since its introduction, how it's developed, and when I bring up the brain as computer metaphor, just because I guess there's been some talk, and Adrian Underhill and Jim Scrivener with their demand high thing, maybe it was something they were addressing. It's just it's a kind of metaphor that's replaced the brain as an empty vessel which we pour something into. Maybe a lot of instructors know what a CLT lesson looks like, think that if they apply that to this computer-like brain, that's going to result in language teaching. How do you see CLT develop? Do you see it evolving out of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I make the distinction that CLT didn't, when it was first conceived, didn't have a theory of learning. I mean, it was very odd, bizarre that this method came along, and most methods are based on some kind of theory of language, and some kind of theory of learning that kind of fits that nicely. If you look back at the history of CLT, it emerged out of a theory of language. The theory of language is you can describe language in terms of its communicative functions, not in terms of its structures and forms. And so therefore perhaps you could teach it in terms of... But nobody actually, when they came across this amazing insight, which wasn't that amazing because the history of functionalism goes way back into the early 20th century, linguistics and anthropology. But when it was kind of applied to English language teaching, it was applied in forms of changing the syllabus. So we didn't teach structures, we taught functions. And I thought, well, but what does this mean in terms of classroom methodology? Well, what it meant, and I was there, when it was happening. So I kind of, we had to kind of think on our feet, really, in terms of what the methodology. But the methodology kind of emerged. The methodology was, if language is getting to do things, or using language to do things, then we'll have to do things in the classroom. Therefore, we'll have to have things like situations will have to be set up where students can show that they can do things, like making a request, like complaining, like telling a story, like regretting or whatever. We'll have to set up a situation. And once you start doing that, then you get into the whole thing of role plays, you get into the information gaps, and then methodology started to emerge sort of by dint of necessity. By focusing on language and use, you started to use language in the classroom. It was only later that the learning theories came along, which kind of to support that, and one of those was, of course, the Michael Long's interaction hypothesis, that interacting can provide a platform for language acquisition. That was that. Then Merrill Swain's output hypothesis: if you push the learner to go beyond their present competence, then that's good for them. But it wasn't really until socio-cultural learning hit the West. It had been around in Soviet Russia for a very long time, of course, Vygotskian learning theory, that you learn through social interaction with sort of better others, and that learning is a scaffolded process. And when that started to play, I thought, wow, this is the theory of learning that we lacked for 10, 15 years. It suddenly came along mercifully. And of course, by that stage, however, sadly, CLT had kind of retreated into a kind of we can postpone using the language. We don't have to learn the language through using it. We can postpone that. Which, first of all, we'll teach the language, going back to the traditional grammatical syllabus, and then we can do some kind of practice activities to activate it. And so there was this major retreat in the mid-1980s before the learning theories came along really to vindicate that no, it's wrong. You can learn a language by using it. You can, because Vygotsky said so. Michael Long said so. Merrill Swain said so. Too late. The course books go, no, we don't like it. We don't like teaching functions and notions. Let's go back to teaching the present simple. And of course, corpus linguistics came along too, which gave an added impetus to the kind of language side of things. Saying, it's not just the present simple. There's all this other language out there we could teach too, lexical chunks, and blah blah blah, etc. So the linguists, the people who describe language, had the running in terms of directing the direction of the course of directing how the CLT has evolved in a sense, and not the people who study psycholinguistics or how languages are learned. Unfortunately, however, that's where it seems to me some of the most interesting stuff is going on. Looking at both first language and second language acquisition through different metaphors, coming back to your original question, not going beyond, of course, the empty vessel, but going beyond the computer and moving into metaphors of scaffolding, co-construction, participation. And these are all yes, this is what the communicative approach should have been about. But these metaphors came along too late, and we were left with a metaphor which is in fact it's the computer one, but computer in the sense of an information processor. So the mind is an information processing machine, and it is constrained by capacity and stuff like that. And that's very much the paradigm that we've been in, and we're struggling to escape. And there's a war going on, not on the level of classrooms and teachers, but there's a war going on amongst applied linguistics as to which way we should go. Carry on with the information processing metaphor, or take the route of the participation, emergentism, dynamic systems theory. There's a real battle going on as we speak.
How long does that take to kind of filter?
I don't know. Well, Thomas Kuhn, or whoever it was who first talked about paradigm shifts, I think used to say, did he say it was like a 25-year cycle? Really? It takes that long. Maybe nowadays with technology things happen quicker. But I think things move inexorably, really, at the level, particularly when you factor in the big business interests that are going to, as I said before, put a kind of brake on any innovation. And I'm talking about the course books, I'm talking about the exams, etc. And they really do put a brake on any innovation.
In that case, the technology might be part of that, putting the brakes on.
Well, technology can do two things. It can put the brakes on, but it can also free people to actually explore different things and their own particular metaphors, etc. I mean, I'm skeptical about the way technology is being used currently in language education within classrooms, but I'm very hopeful about its uses outside of classrooms. To put learners into contact with other learners, let's say speakers into contact with other speakers, and to provide the kind of massive exposure to the language which seems to be, that seems to be what the research is saying is necessary. So if you're going to get those 8,000 words of vocabulary to get you through, to get you an IELTS 5.5 or whatever, you're not going to get them in a classroom, mate. You're going to have to do it outside the classroom. But you can do it now. There's masses of stuff there that can help you do that. Not just extensive reading, but extensive reading plus using all the kind of informational resources of the internet, etc.
I guess blogging is one way
Blogging.
like a catalyst for this kind of movement, I guess.
What you mean, blogging?
Blogging from the teacher's point of view.
Yes, I know. Well, this is the other thing, of course. That technology has put teachers in touch with teachers in a way that never existed before.
Right.
So any teacher, whatever stage of the development, now has free access to the best ideas around. Doesn't have to wait 18 months for them to be published in a journal. They're there. I mean, it takes a lot of sorting out, of course, and discrimination. Say but there's a lot of stuff being talked about that's really very exciting. So that may, that may move the paradigm, shift along a bit.
Okay, great. I think on that note, we'll bring things to a close. So thank you very much again for bringing talk to us. I appreciate it a lot.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Pleasure. My pleasure. Good questions.
Thank you very much for listening to today's episode, and we'd like to thank Scott again for agreeing to take part in the interview. As usual, if you have any questions or comments, you can contact us at teflology@gmail.com, or you can follow us on Twitter @teflology. We'll be back with a regular episode soon.